And I'm going to close out our series called Changed by Love. Through this series, the last couple of weeks, we've been exploring the Song of Songs. And this is often a book in the Old Testament that gets overlooked, and especially as it's a central focus as a central focus for a sermon series. Oftentimes, it's mainly due to just the content and the language that Solomon uses as he is writing it. And so, just as a show of hands, how many of you would say you've usually steered away from Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, because it's kind of weirds you out a little bit, like the language that's used and it's a little off? Not as many as I thought. Okay, y'all are great Christians in here. Awesome. All right. But we have felt the important need, though, to really go through Song of Songs and look at its importance. We don't want to leave anything out as the Lord highlights it to us. And one of the main things that we've really been looking at is this idea of intimacy with God. Intimacy with God. And we can often find ourselves straying away from this idea of intimacy, especially as men. We think that it's something that just kind of seems foreign to us. And there's this thing that's just left where we're kind of perplexed. We don't really understand the Song of Songs because we don't understand what this intimacy looks like. And Tony and Mandy did a fantastic job the last couple of weeks really going through this and really digging deeper into Solomon's words and Solomon's heart as he's expressing his love to the woman of his affection. So what we're going to do is we're going to center, though, back to this title of our series that's called Changed by Love. And what we want to do is we want to remind ourselves about this truth, that as we encounter God on a deeper and more intimate level, His love changes us. And here's the thing, change is action, right? So the definition of change is to make or become different. Something is happening, it's changing, right? You think like Transformers, they're changing from a car to a robot, right? There's an instantaneous change that happens. So when we encounter God's love, as we've been talking about in this series, when we truly encounter His love, it should make us different as a result. When we truly come into God's presence and we understand and we grasp what's at His heart, there should be such a change that happens to us that it compels us to act and to then make a change on the world around us. There's this our heart begins to change because of it. And I want to show just kind of a little illustration today in nature, and that is this. How many of you know what this next flower is, this plant is? What is it? Hydrangea. All right, is that anybody's favorite flower? Okay. Tony educated a little bit. I was surprised Tony's plant knowledge and volunteer service. So this is a breed of hydrangea called endless summer hydrangeas. And so you'll see here that there are 3 different colors of the hydrangea bush here and the hydrangea flower. And the reason why is because the color of the blooms are dependent upon the kind of soil that the plant is growing in. So for instance, if the soil is acidic, it results in more blue blooms like you see in the center there. If the soil is more alkaline, it results in the pink blooms. And if it's more neutral, it results in the purple bloom. So in a way, it's like nature's litmus test. And oftentimes, gardeners and people who are dealing with flowers will use this knowledge to meet the demands of people who are wanting the flowers. And so they'll have their kind of soil, and they'll treat their soil as such to result in the kind of colors that they are looking for. And in so many of our lives, in the same way, our outward actions and focuses reflect the inward nature of our heart and where our heart is at, how it's rooted, and whether it's rooted in the Lord or not. And this isn't on a slide, but we just see the words of Jesus in Luke 6:45, and He says, "A good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart." So as we spend time in God's presence and we absorb the things that He has for us, His intimacy and His love, it should then compel us to change. The outward part of ourselves should look different like these flowers because we have spent time with the Lord. The number one key to this all, though, is that we must keep the Lord, we must keep God as the number one priority in our lives. And as we close out this series on Changed by Love, the question then is, we've been looking at Solomon's word, doing kind of a study on the softer side of Solomon, but was he really changed by love? Clearly he encountered God, at least in a season of his life, but was he ultimately changed by love? Did he keep God as the number one spot in his life? Or did he drift away from his devotion to God? And I would urge that Solomon encountered God in a deep and intimate way. And I want to highlight to you again a real important scripture from Song of Songs. And this comes from chapter 4, verse 9, because this really, really shows that soft and intimate side of Solomon that he really experienced after he had spent time with the Lord. He says to the woman of his affection, "For when you reach into my heart, with one flash of your eyes, I am undone by your love, my beloved, my equal, my bride." So men in the room, I want you all to do that now. No, I'm just kidding. "You leave me breathless. I am overcome." I've got some women in here like, I wish my husband did this. "I am overcome by merely a glance from your worshiping eyes, for you have stolen my heart. I am held hostage by your love and by the graces of righteousness shining upon you." So these kind of words, this kind of expression comes from a place as Solomon has spent time intimately in God's presence, and that outpoured through it. But did he truly allow himself, did he truly allow his life to be changed by the Lord? And the reality of it all, the real kicker of it all, is he didn't. Unlike his father David, where the scriptures say that David was a man after God's own heart, Solomon did not continually shift his focus back to the Lord. We see many times in David's life that David messes up. David has his issues. But at the end of it all, his heart is positioned in a place where he knows what wrongs he has done, and he begins to put his focus back on the Lord through it all to the end of his days. But unfortunately, Solomon, that was not the case. And that's what we're going to, again, look more at here today. And so today we're going to reflect on some key moments in Solomon's life that I really believe will be important as we move forward, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be kicking off next week. Pastor Tony's going to be kicking off our new series called Foolproof. And this is going to be going through the wisdom of Proverbs, the Proverbs of Solomon, the wisdom that comes from Solomon. So I'm speaking up here today and you're like, okay, well, you're saying that he messed up and he failed. Why do I want to listen to what he has to say? That's what I'm here to share with you today, so stay tuned, all right? So we're going to go through today and we're going to look at the importance and some key moments of Solomon's life and what things we can take away from that. And Solomon's words in the Proverbs act as a guide for daily wisdom for our lives, things that Solomon at the end of his days found to be true, that even though he messed up, there are instructions for our lives from things and the wisdom that he learned. So here's the thing. Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. But here's the thing. Solomon had wisdom, but he did not always choose to act on it during the course of his life, and it eventually allowed him to be led astray. So this is one of those cases where Solomon's loss is our gain. We're going to learn things from Solomon's life and what he didn't do right so that we can use that as a blueprint and a map for how we can do things the correct way in the Lord. And so one of Solomon's biggest downfalls, I would say, if not the biggest downfall in his life, was women. I'm saying that. Some of you men out there today may say, hey, that's mine too. This message is even more for you, all right? And I mean, we see this, right? We see such deep expressions of love in the Song of Songs. So we can't deny that Solomon was a romantic at heart. Women were his thing. I mean, we're about to read here about this. So let's get into it. So in 1 Kings chapter 11, we actually see an epilogue given of Solomon's life. Again, the wisest man who ever lived. And so imagine, if you will, you've read a book, you've read it all, and you want to see, how does the story end? What does this look like? And that's what we're going to look at here. In 1 Kings 11, 1 through 6, it says, "Now Solomon loved many foreign women, Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, "You must not marry them, because they will turn your hearts to their gods." Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives. Men, imagine 700 wives. That's a lot. Of royal birth and 300 concubines. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely, as his father David had done. So, man, what a kicker of an epilogue this was. Solomon, wisest man, had to have started off good, right? Like, he starts off strong and then falls so drastically short. That's how so many of you are feeling about the Colts the last, decade, right? They're starting off strong. Maybe they don't even start off strong. They're just dropping the ball. And here's a guy that, he's got all this wisdom. He's got all this knowledge. He's got all of the know-how. And yet he comes he's like, yes, he's going to do it right. Oh, nope, he dropped the ball. He dropped the ball, and again, just you're left with why are you doing this? You're supposed to be the wisest dude ever, right? So that's, again, what we're going to look at here today. What happened to Solomon, right? And so as we begin today, the question I have for you is, what has your heart? So who or what is it that you have given a number one priority to in your life? This is affections, this is passion, something that you have been focusing on more than the Lord. And so I've got an illustration here that I want to share with you this morning. And we've got some chairs here up on the stage, and I just really love this illustration I came across. And we have 4 chairs here. And imagine, if you will, with me, that these 4 chairs represent the priority spots in your life. So here's me, Clint, John, Tony, anyone's right here. This chair right here is the number one spot in your life, and then so on, so forth, and it goes down the chain from there, right? And so there are things that we naturally put in our lives. Now, I would wager to say there's more than 4 things. I could probably fill up every single chair in the auditorium with something that we prioritize in our lives, right? But I've collected here this morning a couple things that really have typically some kind of focus in our lives, things that take us away. So the first thing, we've got God, right? All of us as Christians should admit, right? God should have a spot on the chair of our heart, right? So we've got God here. And then I'm just going to sit down and get a little more comfortable here. So we've got God, right? And then we've got marriage and family. So that's an important one here. So we've got marriage and family, so you'd recognize that, my family, I want to make sure that they're prioritized. I want to make sure that they come first. My spouse, my significant other, I want to make sure that they have a focus of my life. Career. For you, many of you spent thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a career, going through college. Maybe some of you are just working a 9-to-5 job right now, and you're giving it the all you can, and that's taken up a lot of your time, right? And so the next thing is, we work a career, so we get money and we get stuff, things that we accumulate, and that has some of our focus in our life. And then lastly, hobbies. So some of you in the room, maybe you've got some things that really intrigue you. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's some kind of maybe reading, something like that. I'm a big hobby, or I love to hobby. Maybe cars is your hobby. Whatever it is, there is something that you would say is a nice leisure activity for you. And so as we think about this, and we think through, okay, what should have the top priorities in our lives? And we're going to do a little bit of audience participation here. As Christians, what should have the number one seat in our life? God, okay. So far, so good. You got an A so far. What would you say of the things I mentioned, so hobbies, money and stuff, career, marriage and family, what would you say would probably be a good second seat? You guys are on track this morning. You're doing wonderful. And so then maybe, you got your marriage and your family, but you want to make sure, that you've got a career, because you've got to be able to provide for that family, and so on and so forth. And then, you have your hobbies. But actually, you've started to decide, you know what, my career has really taken up a lot of my life. And so I would probably, put money and stuff here on the third chair. And, my career, I've got that going. And so it's kind of what my life's looking like. And so what happens then? So what often happens is, in the similar way as these chairs here, we oftentimes find ourselves prioritizing things more than God, right? And this is a reflection, I think, of most of our lives. And so again, then, I ask you, what has your heart? What's in the number one priority spot of your life? Matthew 6:21, the words of Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." And the point that I want to make, again, as we begin, is that our hearts are always captivated by something. There is always something that is going to draw our heart's attention. And we're going to see today that just like with Solomon, something drew his heart away. Multiple things drew his heart away from his focus on the Lord. So again, what or who has your heart today? And I want to keep this at the forefront of your mind today as we continue. And so we just have to recognize that all of us come from different backgrounds, different places we've been, different seasons of life, things that we have gone through. But I want to emphasize today that no matter where you've been, no matter what you've gone through, no matter what you will go through, that when you encounter the love of God, that it so changes you, that everything in you changes because you have encountered God in a deeper and more intimate way. And Solomon got but a glimpse of this, and yet he got led astray by the other things of this world. And so today we're going to look at a few snapshots of King Solomon's life, and we're going to look at his background, because what I want us to recognize is, where did he go wrong? How did the wisest man who ever lived fall so short? And that's what we're going to look at. So I'm just going to summarize for you 1 Kings chapter 1, kind of what's going on, kind of set the stage for this. And so what we see in 1 Kings 1 is that King David is on his deathbed. David's on his deathbed. He's old, he's feeble, and he's just doing everything to try to stay cold. There's more to that story. I encourage you to read the whole story in its entirety. But David had his first of three sons had died. His first three sons had died. And so his fourth son, by the name of Adonijah, was next in line for succession. And so he should have been king. So he was next in line to take the throne. But what happens is that David hasn't even passed away yet, and Adonijah takes it upon himself to basically call himself king, to take the throne from David without David even knowing about it. So I just want to pause for a minute. If we're honest, we talked about David being a man after God's own heart, but I don't think David got Father of the Year award. When we look at David's life, let's look at it. His son Absalom in prior years, in the same vein, wound up trying to overthrow and kill his father. And then, David has a son named Amnon that rapes his sister, and so then he's killed by Absalom. It's this whole thing. And we just look at this and we think, so let's look at David. Let's look at his parenting style. Like Clint, you say he's close to God. How is it that his kids went so far off the deep end? Well, we see a little evidence of this, a little glance of this in 1 Kings 1:6. The first part of it, it says, now his father, speaking of Adonijah, says, now his father, King David, had never disciplined him at any time, even by asking, why are you doing that? How many fathers in the room would say at some point in your fatherhood you have disciplined your child in some way? Maybe some harsher terms than others, right? But you would recognize that discipline is an important part of the growing up process. Now, I would urge that discipline and love, and that correction is what leads to the best outcome. But if David was truly a man after God's own heart, why did he have such conflict with his children? And here's the reality of things. You can have your focus set on the Lord. You can be so head set on focusing on God that your family actually winds up becoming non-existent. So what happens, instead of partnering with your family and flowing the love of God down through them, you completely can turn your back and just be focused so much on the Lord that you miss his very commands to love one another, to love your family, to love those in your life. And there's an example of this. When I was growing up, there was a prominent preacher that I really had looked up to over the years. And his name, I've shared him before, his name is Charles Stanley. And Charles was someone who was really dedicated to his ministry. He was really just focused on his ministry. And he's on the left. On the right is his son, Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley is still a pastor of one of the largest churches in Georgia, North Point Church, and he's done a lot of leadership development stuff. And Andy is still in the ministry. But one of the things with this father-son relationship was there was a lot of division. Because what happened was Charles was so focused on his ministry and on the Lord that he neglected his wife and he neglected his children as well. And I would wager to say that's what was happening to David as well. And there's actually, in 1995, what actually wound up coming about was Anna Stanley, Charles's wife. She had said this about it. She said they asked, like, what brought about? They actually wound up getting a divorce. And she was asked, what brought this about? And she said, many years of discouraging disappointments and marital conflict. Charles, in effect, abandoned our marriage. He chose his priorities, and I have not been one of them. And this wasn't exclusive to just Charles and Anna. This was also, I was reading some stories this week. Rick and Kay Warren, same thing with their marriage. Rick Warren wrote The Purpose-Driven Church. You know, he also got so focused on the ministry that his family began to be neglected. And they have since worked through that, and they've worked that out now in these later years, but it was a struggle for them. John Wesley's another one. There were so many. It was crazy, all the research I was doing, how many men or how many people in ministry, men or women, neglected those in their lives because they got so focused on just God and God alone. And hear me, it is absolutely pivotal that you focus on the Lord, you focus on Jesus. But parents in the room today, if you have not made your family a priority next to the Lord, and you just neglected them, and you don't know what love of God looks like to flow to them, then the very same types of things, maybe not as severe as we saw with David and his kiddos, but the same types of things happen. And so if you wonder, I've really been having a kid that's struggling. I get kids struggle for various reasons. There's a lot of things in this world that have just really skewed the lines. But as parents, if you're wondering, why are my kids this way? What's happening here? I would just urge you to question, what's your relationship with them look like? What does your relationship with God look like? And are you listening to his command to love those in your life? And so we see the story continue, and the prophet Nathan gets wind of Adonijah's conspiracy, and he acts on Solomon's behalf. So he knows that it's not only God's will, but David's will that Solomon was to become the next king. And so just a little quick kind of backstory of who Solomon's mom was. It's Bathsheba. And if you remember the story of David, Bathsheba was the one that David was so affectionate with that he wound up taking her as his own and sent her husband to the front lines to have him killed. Had a child with her, that child died, and then we have Solomon that came from Bathsheba and David's union. So we see it said in 1 Kings 1, 28 through 30, King David responded, "Call Bathsheba," once he heard about this. So she came back in and stood before the king, and the king repeated his vow, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has rescued me from every danger, your son Solomon will be the next king and will sit on my throne to this very day, just as I vowed to you before the Lord, the God of Israel." And so what we see here is that the Lord had a plan for Solomon long before Solomon even had any idea. That it should have been to his brother that the kingdom came, right? But instead, God had another plan, and that was that Solomon was to be the next king of Israel. And so we're going to pick up in 1 Kings 3, verse 3, to look at some very important moments in Saul's life as he starts out, his early life, as he starts out on his journey. So it says that Solomon loved the Lord. All right, here we go. Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David. So it sounds like he's off to a pretty good start, right? Except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at the local places of worship. The most important of these places of worship was at Gibeon, so the king went there and sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings. So God's law says that the Israelites could only make sacrifices in specific places. This was to prevent the people from instituting their own methods of worship and introducing those pagan practices to start creeping in. And here we see that Solomon loved God, but at the same time, this act that he had just done was sin. However, even though Solomon had just sinned, God still met him where he was at. God still saw his heart at this moment and this point in his life. And this is what we see happen. 1 Kings 3:3-14. That night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you have continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on this throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I am like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted." So here we see that Solomon is humbling himself, recognizing he doesn't have the answers. "Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth," right, the genie in the bottle thing, a couple more wishes, "or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you ask for, but I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has or will ever have." So again, the wisest man who ever lived. "And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands, as your father David did, I will give you a long life." So here's the thing. We see that even despite Saul's sin the prior day, God still sees his heart. God still meets him where he's at. And not only does Solomon ask humbly for wisdom because he recognizes he can't do it all on his own, but on top of that, God decides to bless him because of this act of his heart. And he not only gives him riches, but he gives him fame as well. And how many of us in our lives have asked the Lord, "Lord, I would really love this right now. I really could use a new car. It doesn't have to be spanking new. Like, I just need a car. I need a house. God, I need a girlfriend. I need a boyfriend." And maybe God grants you that. But then he decides to give you something even more than that. And you're so thankful and you're so grateful for what he's given you, but what winds up happening? And it's what we see happening in Solomon's life. The very thing that God gives him as a blessing winds up turning into a curse because his focus is in the wrong spot. And he turns his affection to the things of the world and the things that the world has to offer him instead of the Lord. And we're going to continue to look about that today. So Solomon received a wise and understanding heart from God, but it was up to him to apply that wisdom in all areas of his life. So let me ask you again, what or who has your heart? Have you experienced God's blessings in your life? And even though you have fallen short at times, you would still say that I am so grateful for what God has given me. But what happens is that your focus becomes just stays focused on those things. Maybe God has put you in a financial situation to where you can afford to go on a bunch of vacations, you can go to a bunch of sports games, and all of that kind of stuff. And then if you look back over your past month, you would say that your time involved in church activities, your time involved in a small group, your time involved with other believers has continued and continued and continued to decline because the other things that you have found as a blessing in your life have gotten more of your affection than the Lord. So if you allowed those blessings to become the core of your focus, and that's kind of, again, what we see happen with Solomon. So let's return to part of that epilogue that I shared with you earlier of Solomon, 1 Kings 11, 4-6. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshiped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Man, what was evil? I mean, think about that. You start off strong, but then it's written about you that you did evil in God's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. So what I want to point out here is that Ashtoreth was a goddess that symbolized reproductive power. Kind of give you a little backstory here. She was the mistress of the god Baal. And then, more importantly, I want to highlight that Molech, this other god that he found himself caught up in worshiping, was called detestable because the worship involved sacrificing children, child sacrifice. So think about that. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and yet allowed his heart to be bound to other women that drew his heart away from God, so much so that he worshiped another god who was involved with child sacrifice. It's really food for thought, isn't it? Some pretty despicable stuff to let your heart wander off to. So although Solomon had clear instructions from God not to marry other pagan women from foreign nations, he chose to disregard this. So he knew he was the wisest man. He had the wisdom to choose what was right, but he didn't do it. God knows our strengths, but he also knows our weaknesses. His commands are always for our good. Yet with all of this wisdom, Solomon didn't come to fully grasp this during the major course of his life until his final years. And so for all of the wisdom that Solomon had, he had his weak spots. He couldn't say no to compromise, to lustful desires. And though we saw in Song of Songs, he had a heart that he had connected with the Father. He knew what intimacy with God looked like, but he didn't keep that heart tethered and connected to God. And like I mentioned with those hydrangeas earlier, he didn't allow his life to fully be changed by his time spent with God's presence. So here's the thing. If Solomon, the wisest man, could fall, so can you. So Solomon at first resisted the pressures that came his way, the temptations that came his way. And then he began to tolerate, we start seeing this pattern occur, he started to tolerate more widespread practices of idolatry in his life. And then that led to rationalizing away the potential danger to himself and the kingdom. And so this paints a picture, this pattern right here is what sin looks like. We have the ability to resist it at first. Okay, I'm doing all right. But then you start tolerating something. Oh, well, it's okay. I'm just going to let it just be a part of it because, everybody else is doing that. And then it turns into that rationalization where you start just saying, you know what? It's okay. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. So where you have tolerated something to happen, you've not addressed it. I want to clarify this, where you've not addressed it with tolerating it. Then all of a sudden now you're making excuses, which is rationalization. You're making excuses as to why it's okay that it's there. Unfortunately for Mandy, I didn't have alliteration for this one. So if you think of that another word for tolerate, let me know. So again, what has your heart? What is it that you have allowed to create this pattern in your life to draw you away from God, to creep your focus away from the Lord, like what happened in Solomon's life? And so if we go back again to the chair example, what has your heart, right? So we would recognize that this has kind of become a pattern of our lives. And instead of being on the floor, God should really be the priority in our lives. Because everything else in comparison with the Lord means nothing. So here's the thing. If you really think about it today, why don't we let God in the first chair of our life? It's because we don't really want him there. You know what? God, you're great. No, I'm going to come to Sunday services and all. That's awesome. I'm gonna pursue you. I'm gonna take away what Pastor Tony, Pastor Mandy, Pastor Clint have to say. But I gotta go to a game later. I got something else I gotta do. So eventually, God continues to find his way shifted out. And so, again, when we don't keep God as a top priority of our lives, we find such chaos that can ensue from that. Because here's the thing. We all pursue what we want most, right? Like, let's be honest about it. We pursue what we want most. If you want a good career, if you want a good job, if you want to have a great family, if you want to, have a hobby, a great hobby like competitive speed knitting or something, like whatever it is, like you're going to put all your effort into it. You're going to give it everything that you've got. So then why do we not give God everything we have? And again, it's because we just don't really want to give him that focus of our life. Because we don't really want him that much. And so as you're sitting here this morning, this message is not meant to be a gloom and doom message, not meant to be a discouragement for you. But what we have to do, again, as we transition into a new series of the wisdom of Solomon, we recognize that he's got some really important words to say to us. Where the Song of Songs showed this softer side of Solomon and his more deeper and intimate moments. The wisdom of the Proverbs comes because Solomon has reflected back over his life, and he recognizes, I do not want others to make the same mistake that I have made. And here's the thing. So I mentioned earlier a couple of these things. You've got hobbies, you've got money and stuff, something that always takes your focus, right? And I want you to think today, what is it in your life that has taken that priority? And I want to share with you, I shared last time I was up here, that the Lord was challenging me to fast from social media, to get off completely of social media. And I tried to rationalize it, right? So I'm sure that's what Solomon's doing in these moments. Well, do you want it all, God, or do you just want some of it? But I really felt like God said, I want it all. Take it all off the phone. Get rid of it all. So I got rid of Facebook off the phone, Instagram. I don't have Snapchat. I know some of y'all do. I don't have Snapchat on the phone. All these other apps that are out there that take away the focus. Because I began to recognize what was taking the first chair in my life, and it wasn't God. I would wake up in the mornings, and the first thing I would do is when my alarm went off, I would reach over to the phone, put it in front of me, and start doom scrolling. Watching the next video, and the algorithm was figuring me out. I didn't like that. It's creepy. Started talking, when you're talking to somebody else in the house, and then all of a sudden you open your phone, and there it is on your phone. They're listening, y'all. But through this process for me, what I recognized was that I was allowing something else to have a first chair in my life instead of the Lord. And I want to tell you today that it has been, I think, almost a month since I last preached. And I have seen the Lord come into my life and work in ways that I did not even know were possible because I obeyed him and got rid of the thing that he asked me to get rid of in this season. And what I found was happening is that the first thing, instead of reaching for my phone, other than to turn off the alarm, I would pull out my journal and just start journaling, getting with the Lord, being with him in his presence. And he would just speak new things for me every day. I would find that there were just things in my life, stresses that were coming about because I'd just see something crazy online and just upset me, And I haven't had that for a whole month, and it's been amazing the changes that's happened in me because I stopped that. I got it out of the first chair. And so for you, what is it in your life that God is saying, I want this out of the first chair? He wants your heart, folks. He wants your heart. Will you let him have it? Just even last night, I was, typically if I've had a busier week and a crazier week with just stuff going on, I typically will go in the basement in my hobby room and do some hobbying. And so last night, I had just finished kind of some final prep for today, and I went down into the basement. I hadn't done some hobbying in a little bit, so I went down, and I just started hobbying, starting to do some stuff and organizing some stuff and do everything there, and started to find its way as a center of my focus. And in and of itself, it's not wrong, because we all have to have these means that we can enjoy to kind of be able to disconnect sometimes and just find the ability to enjoy something because God gives us things to enjoy. But what I notice, and here's the key, you must be responsive to the Holy Spirit's prompting in your life. So when I was in the basement and I was doing my hobbying, I'm down there, and I can't tell you anything but like, there's this voice, I'm just hearing, come get with me. Just doing it. Come get with me. Okay, all right. And I just want to chill. I want to enjoy the hobbies. I'm not trying to shut God up. He said, just get with me. And I'm proud to say that in that moment I recognized that he was asking me in this very same manner to come and to get away with him. And so I shut the light off downstairs. I went up and I got time with the Lord. I opened up the scriptures. I read through that. I journaled, found new ways to connect with God because he said, I have something for you. And I had some new things that I wrote down in my journal that he gave me that I would not have heard if I just kept hobbying away. So again, in and of itself, the hobbying wasn't wrong. The things that you do and enjoy in your life aren't wrong. But what seat do they have? And are you willing in those moments to shift things as God asks you to do that? And so, today, I've got a few scriptures that I want to close with this morning, and the first one is going to come from Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes, if you're not familiar with it, it's more of like a lament from Solomon. Like, be ready to read Ecclesiastes if you're reading there, because it's kind of a downer for most of it. But there was a real key scripture that stood out to me as I was reading through all of the scriptures that were related to Solomon and everything over the last couple of years. And it's from Ecclesiastes 2:1. He says, I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. So again, he continues to let us know that all of this stuff is meaningless. He's chased after women. He's chased after the things of this earth. None of them have satisfied. They're all meaningless in comparison with his heavenly Father. So, the final thing that he shared that I want to share with you comes from Proverbs. So again, kind of teeing up. Proverbs 4, he says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. I'm going to have the band start making their way up, and they've offered to help me with these chairs up on the stage. I recognize it's a hefty job. But what I want us to do this morning is to reflect on this scripture, this Proverbs, this word of wisdom. And as we recognize that with Solomon, he went through a lot. He made some he was the wisest of fools. He made some really bad choices in his time. But Solomon went through this all so that we don't have to. We can learn from his story. And so he says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. And so what I want you to do this morning is I just want everybody to just close their eyes. Without looking around, just close your eyes. This is our moment to, if you're thinking, well, Clint, I'm just really struggling throughout my week to just put God first. Let's start now. Let's do it now. So with eyes closed. I want you to think about this morning, what is something that has taken a priority spot on the seat of your heart? And once you've identified that, again, not looking around, but I just in an acknowledgement, I want just a show of hands. When you've identified something, just put your hand up. When you've identified something that's just taken priority in your life, just put your hand up. Again, nobody's looking around. No judgments, nothing. Okay. This is what honesty looks like. We have to recognize, again, we can't tolerate it. We can't resist it. We have to recognize these things that have taken the first seat in our life. And so right now, what I just want us to do is take a posture of prayer. The hearts must be in the right position, and we just want to give these things back to the Lord. So with still eyes closed, I still want to acknowledge, maybe you're here today and you would just say that I've not even encountered God. I don't even know what his love looks like. And for you, you would say that you have attended church, but you have never come into the saving grace of what his son did for you on the cross. And today, may today be that day that you say yes to him. Because everything I have shared today, all of this wisdom that we've talked about, none of it comes aside from the Father and his gift of salvation through Jesus on the cross. And so if that's you today, I would encourage you this morning, don't leave today before you come and you get prayer. I'm going to have ministry. I'm going to have you open your eyes now. I'm going to have ministry team members start to make their way. I'm going to have everybody stand as well. I'm Ministry team members can make their way down front. There's a couple ways, again, that we can respond today. And we recognize the importance of partnering with each other in prayer. And so as we have people who will be down front, we'd love to pray for you. So if you have something in your life that you would recognize has kept the first chair spot in your life, and you say, I want to give that to the Lord. I cannot do this on my own. I need help. Come forward. Get prayer for that. Ask for prayers of empowerment, prayers of encouragement that you would be able to resist the things that are trying to draw your attention away from the Lord. And again, as we just go back to that thought that God isn't on our first chair because so many of us just don't want him there. Why would we not? In light of all that he's done for us, in light of his love and saving grace in our lives. And so again, as we conclude this Changed by Love series, we recognize that we are changed by love. We are people changed by the love of Jesus in our lives. May it compel us to act, because change is nothing if that change doesn't compel us to act and influence others' lives. There's going to be communion available around the room today to partake. You don't have to be a member, just love Jesus. And may that be a symbol for you that you are uniting yourself with the bread, the body and the blood of Jesus and what he did for you this morning. And so we're going to go into our time of worship here this morning. But again, I would just encourage you, don't leave here today without the recognition that you can be changed by the love of Jesus in your life, and without the knowledge that he should be the first chair in your life. So I leave you with that question: what or who has your heart? And may it today be Jesus.